The frost had come early to the Drummond lands that year, and it had come like a creditor who already knew the door would not be barred against him. It crept along the stone sills of Aldermore Hall, settled in the cracks of the mullioned windows, slipped beneath the warped oak of the kitchen door, and made itself at home in rooms that had once known fires year-round. The hall was a vast Scottish keep of grey granite, set above a loch the colour of slate, and in the days of Tamsin Drummond's grandfather, it had been a place of pipers and venison, and tables long enough to feed 100. Now it was a place of shuttered wings and dust sheets, of corridors where a single candle had to do the work of 20, of rooms where the wind sang through gaps no one could afford to mend. Tamsin moved through it, as she had moved through it since she was 12, when her mother died, and her father began his long, quiet drowning in claret and credit. She wore a faded blue cloak over a brown linen dress she had mended at the elbows 3 times, and her hair was pinned plainly because there was no maid left to dress it more kindly. She did not weep at the cold. She had decided, long ago, that tears were a currency she would not spend on weather, on debt, on her father's silences, on any of the small daily indignities of a great house dying in slow motion. She kept her tears, though she did not yet know what she was keeping them for. In the mornings, she counted the eggs the 2 remaining hens still gave them. She walked down to the tenants' cottages with a basket over her arm and inquired after the sick, and the tenants, who loved her without quite knowing how to say so, gave her oatcakes and apologies, and the news that the rents could not, this quarter, be what they had been. She brought the news home to her father, Lorcan Drummond, the laird of an estate that no longer paid for its own peat, and Lorcan would nod and paw and turn his face to the fire as though the fire could speak in his stead. He had been a tall man once. He had grown smaller, year by year, until at 50 he seemed almost translucent, a man becoming a draught. The letters from Edinburgh and London came thicker every season, sealed with red wax and addressed in the impatient hand of solicitors. Tamsin opened them, because her father no longer would, and she read figures that should have made her cold, except she was already cold, and had been for a long time. The debt had grown teeth. The bank in Inverness wanted the South Fields. The merchant in Glasgow wanted the silver. The London houses wanted, in their polite and ruinous English, simply everything. And then one grey afternoon in late October, when the loch was wearing its first thin skin of ice, a black carriage came up the rutted road from the village, and a man who did not belong to any of their lives stepped down from it. He was tall, and his coat was the kind of black that swallowed light rather than wore it, and his face had been carved by a sculptor who believed in severity above all other virtues. He gave his name to no one but the door, and the door, in the form of old Hester Penhallow, who had been housekeeper at Aldermore since before Tamsin was born, let him in because there was nothing else to do with a man who looked at a house the way he looked at theirs, as though he had already bought it and was deciding which walls to keep. His name was Casimir Hargreave, and he was, by the courtesies of 2 kingdoms, the Duke of Strathallan, and he had come, he said, to discuss a matter of mutual benefit with the laird. Lorcan received him in the library, which was the warmest room only because Tamsin had ordered the last of the good wood burned there that morning, anticipating a visitor she could not have named. She stood in the corner as she always stood, useful and unseen, a daughter who poured the whiskey and refilled the lamps, and was not introduced because there was no one left who thought to introduce her. The Duke spoke in short sentences. He had, he said, particular need of a wife. His circumstances required it within the month. He had been told, by parties he did not trouble to name, that the house of Drummond had a daughter of marriageable age and a debt of remarkable proportion. He proposed an exchange. The debt would be answered in full by his solicitors before the week was out. The South Fields would be restored. The tenants would be secured. In return, he required the daughter, and her silence, and her presence at his estate in the Highlands by the first snowfall. There was no offer of affection in the proposal. There was, Tamsin noticed, no offer of unkindness either. It was a ledger spoken aloud. Her father, who had not looked at her in months in any way that recognized her as a person rather than a fixture, looked at her then with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, because it was the expression of a drowning man who has just been shown a rope and is calculating quickly whether his daughter weighs less than his shame. He said yes before she had drawn breath to speak. The Duke turned his head, perhaps an inch, and looked at her properly for the first time, and his eyes were the grey of the loch in November, and they registered her plain dress, her unadorned hair, her hands that had carried baskets and scrubbed pots, and they registered her without contempt and without interest. He inclined his head. He said, to her, and not to her father, that he hoped the arrangement would not be disagreeable. Tamsin, who had decided long ago not to spend her tears on weather or debt, found that she would not spend them on this either. She said very quietly that she would be ready by the first snowfall. The Duke nodded once, as though a small accounting had been balanced, and took his leave. The carriage went back down the rutted road, and the house settled around her like a coat she had outgrown, and her father, in the library, began to weep with relief, and she did not go to him, because she had nothing in her to give him in that moment that would not have been a lie. The snow came on the 12th of November, soft at first and then in earnest, and with it came a second carriage, less black than the first, and lined inside with furs the colour of smoke. Tamsin packed her belongings into a single trunk that was not full when she closed it. She took her mother's prayer book, 3 dresses, including the faded blue one, because she could not bring herself to leave it behind, a miniature of her mother painted when her mother had been younger than Tamsin was now, and a small wooden box containing the seeds she had been saving from the kitchen garden against a spring she had not been sure she would see. Hester Penhallow came down to the carriage with her, wrapped in a shawl that had been new in another century, and Hester, who did not believe in sentiment as a rule, took Tamsin's face between her dry old hands, and said only, "Child, you are worth more than the price he paid. Do not let any roof in the Highlands tell you otherwise." Tamsin kissed the old woman's forehead and climbed into the carriage, and did not look back at her father, who had not come down to see her go. The journey took 2 days. The country grew wilder, the hills steeper, the sky lower, until at last on the second afternoon the carriage rounded a shoulder of rock, and she saw Glenmara below her, the Duke's seat, a vast, pale fortress of granite that seemed to have grown out of the mountain rather than been built upon it. Smoke rose from only a handful of its many chimneys. The avenue of beeches that led to its door was bare and black against the white. The house, even from a distance, had the look of a thing that had forgotten how to be lived in. She was met at the door by the steward, a thin man named Phineas Quayle, who bowed precisely and welcomed her in a voice trained to give nothing away, and behind him stood a line of servants arranged for inspection. They looked at her, this new mistress in her travel-creased blue cloak, and she saw in their faces the careful neutrality of people who had been told nothing and had decided everything. The Duke was not there to receive her. He was, the steward said, detained upon estate business and would join her at supper. She was shown to her rooms, which were enormous and cold, and decorated in the heavy taste of 2 generations past, with bed hangings the colour of dried blood, and a fireplace large enough to roast a sheep in which someone had laid a fire so small it seemed an apology. She thanked the maid who had been assigned to her, a young girl named Maren, with frightened eyes, and asked her name, and used it, and saw the girl startle as though being named was a thing she had not expected from a duchess. Tamsin unpacked her own trunk, because there was very little in it, and because she did not yet know how to ask another woman to touch her mended dresses. She washed her face in cold water. She put on the least faded of her 3 dresses, the grey one, and she went down to supper. The dining room at Glenmara was a hall, not a room. The table ran the length of it like a road, and at its far end the Duke sat alone, and at its near end a place had been laid for her with what she understood, even on her first night, to be a deliberate distance. She walked the length of the table, and her footsteps on the stone floor were the only sound, and she took her seat, and across the impossible expanse of polished oak her husband inclined his head perhaps an inch. They ate in silence. The food was excellent and indifferent. The candles guttered in draughts she could feel from 20 feet away. Halfway through the second course she set down her knife and said, in a voice that carried easily, because the room was built to carry voices, that she thought, with his permission, she would have the table shortened on the morrow, as it seemed a great trouble to the footman to carry plates so far. There was a pause. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The Duke looked at her down the length of the wood, and something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, the almost of one, and he said that she might do as she wished with the table and with the room, and with any other room in the house that displeased her. She thanked him. She finished her meal. She did not stay for the port he did not offer. In her cold red bedroom, she lay awake a long time, listening to a house that did not know her. And she thought, not with self-pity, but with the clear accounting of a woman who had been keeping ledgers since she was 12, that she had been bought and brought to a place that didn't want her, and that she would have to make of it what she could, because there was nowhere else now to go. She did not weep. She slept eventually, and in the morning she rose before the servants and went down to look at her new house in the grey first light, and she began, in the small ways available to her, to learn it. The days that followed taught her Glenmara as one learns a difficult language, slowly, by use, by error, by listening more than speaking. She found that the house had 38 rooms, and that 29 of them were shut. She found that the kitchen garden had been allowed to go to nettle and seed, and that the cook, a stout woman named Brigida, who had come north with the Duke's mother 40 years before, and had stayed out of stubbornness more than loyalty, regarded any inquiry into her domain as an act of war. Tamsin made peace with Brigida, the only way peace was ever made with such women, by sitting at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning with a cup of tea and asking her opinion about onions. By the end of the first week, Brigida was telling her, grudgingly, which of the maids could be trusted with china and which could not, and by the end of the second, she was sending up small dishes of the things she had heard the new Duchess preferred, in case her Grace cared to try them. Tamsin had the great table in the dining hall shortened by half. She had the smaller of the 2 parlours opened and aired, and a proper fire laid in it, and she took her tea there in the afternoons, and after a fortnight she noticed that the steward, Phineas Quayle, had begun to bring his ledgers to her in that room rather than to the Duke's study, because, he said carefully, her Grace seemed to have a quicker eye for arithmetic than was usual. She did have a quicker eye. She had been reading her father's ruin in figures for 6 years, and she found the Duke's accounts, by comparison, a pleasure, because the figures here added up, and the only thing wrong with them was that no one in the house seemed to understand what they were for. She found the library on the 3rd day. It was at the western end of the upper floor, behind a door that stuck, in a room with 3 tall windows that looked out over the loch, and it had been, she could see, the heart of the house once, and had been abandoned to the damp for perhaps 20 years. The books were warping on the shelves. A bird had got in at some point and died on the carpet, and no one had thought to remove it. Tamsin removed the bird. She had Maren and another maid scrub the floor. She opened the windows on a dry day and let the cold, clean wind do what fires could not. She found, in a chest under one of the windows, a set of estate journals in a woman's hand, kept by some long-dead Duchess of Stratallan, who had loved the garden and recorded the planting of every rose. Tamsin read them in the evenings by a fire she had insisted be properly built, and she began to make a list. The Duke she saw at supper, and almost nowhere else. He rode out at dawn and returned at dusk, and he spent his evenings in his study with the door shut, and twice in the first month she heard him climb the stairs to the east wing late at night and not come down again for several hours. And she did not ask what was in the east wing, because no one had offered to tell her, and she had been raised to understand that a closed door in another person's house was a closed door. He was unfailingly courteous to her. He was also unfailingly remote. He asked after her health each evening, as he might have asked after the weather, and he listened to her answers with the attention of a man counting them rather than hearing them, and he did not, in those first weeks, touch her hand or her shoulder or any part of her at all. She had not expected him to. She had not, she discovered, particularly wanted him to, not yet. Not when she did not know him. Not when she suspected he did not know himself in her presence. What surprised her was that she had begun, by small degrees, to want to know him. He had a way of looking at the fire when he thought himself unobserved that was not the look of a cold man. It was the look of a man holding something heavy and tired of holding it. One evening in the 3rd week, she came down to supper and found that the table had been shortened further by his order, so that they sat now within speaking distance of each other. And when she took her place, he did not meet her eyes, but he said quietly that he hoped the new arrangement was more convenient. She said it was. He asked what she had been reading. She told him about the dead Duchess's garden journals. He was silent for a long time, and then he said that the Duchess in question had been his grandmother, and that the roses she had planted were still alive in the South Walk, though no one had pruned them in his lifetime. Tamsin asked, very carefully, whether she might have them pruned. He said she might do as she wished. He said it the way he had said it about the table, as though giving her permission to alter his house were a thing that cost him nothing, and yet, she noticed, cost him something. She pruned the roses herself on a thin, bright morning in early December, with shears she had borrowed from the head gardener, an old man named Ewan Calloway, who watched her work with the suspicion of a man who had been waiting 40 years for someone to ruin his beds, and was reluctantly impressed that she was not ruining them. The thorns tore her hands. She did not mind. When she came back to the house at noon, her palms were bleeding in small, bright lines, and the Duke, who had returned unexpectedly for some paper he had forgotten, met her in the hall and saw her hands before he saw her face. He stopped. He looked at her hands, and then at her face, and then at her hands again, and for the first time since she had come to Glenmara, something in his expression cracked, just slightly, the way a frozen pond cracks under the first warm afternoon. He said, in a voice she had not heard from him before, that she ought to have worn gloves. She said the gloves she had brought were too thin for thorns. He was silent a moment. Then he said that she would have proper ones by evening, and he turned and went into his study and shut the door, and she stood in the hall with her bleeding hands, and felt, for the first time since the carriage had brought her up the avenue, something other than cold. Before I carry you further into this house, and what it became, let me ask one small thing of you, gently, the way one asks a friend. If this story has begun to take hold of you, if you find yourself leaning a little closer to hear what Tamsin will do next, consider subscribing so the next story finds you when it comes. There are so many of these old houses still to enter together, and I would like very much to keep telling them to you. Now, back to Glenmara, where a pair of leather gloves lay that evening upon the Duchess's dressing table, lined in lambskin, soft as a held breath, with no note attached because the Duke of Strathollan was not yet a man who wrote notes, only a man who, one afternoon in December, had noticed a woman's hands and could not seem to unnotice them. He had not meant to notice her at all. Casimir Hargreave had married, he told himself in the small dark hours when he could not sleep, for one reason and one reason only, and that reason slept in the East Wing under the care of 2 nurses and a doctor who came up from Edinburgh once a fortnight and shook his head with the careful gravity of a man who had run out of things to try. The reason was his son. The boy was 4 years old. He had been born to Casimir's first wife, who had died of the bearing of him, and whose loss Casimir had borne, he believed, without flinching, because flinching was a luxury he had been raised not to permit himself. The boy was called Soren, and Soren had been born with a weakness of the lungs and a curvature of the spine that the Edinburgh doctor named in Latin and could not mend in any tongue, and the boy was beautiful and bright and frail, and Casimir loved him with a ferocity that frightened him, and he had married a stranger because the law of his line required an heir of full standing, and his own heart could not bear the thought of putting Soren aside in favour of some hypothetical second son got upon a wife chosen for affection. He had wanted a wife who would not demand to be loved, because he had none left to give that was not already given to a small boy in the East Wing. He had wanted a wife who would not pry, because the boy's existence was not yet known beyond the walls of Glenmara, and Casimir intended to keep it so until the boy was strong enough to be seen, or, if the doctor's silence meant what Casimir feared it meant, until the boy was no longer there to be seen at all. He had been told by a cousin in Edinburgh, who knew the state of the Drummond accounts, that the laird's daughter was plain and practical, and unlikely to make demands upon a husband who answered her debts and asked little in return. He had expected, he realized now, a woman who would arrive at his door, grateful and grasping in equal measure. A woman who would survey his halls and calculate their worth, and set about ornamenting herself at his expense. He had expected, in some buried corner of himself, a schemer, because schemers were what his world had taught him to expect from women brought to great houses by bargains. He had not expected Tamsin Drummond. He had not expected a woman who walked the length of his dining hall in a faded grey dress and proposed, on her first night, to shorten his table because the footmen were tired. He had not expected a woman who asked the kitchen maid her name. He had not expected a woman who pruned his grandmother's roses with her own hands and bled into the gravel without complaint, and came back to the house with the bright, honest blood on her palms, and said, when asked, that her gloves had been too thin. He sat in his study that evening with the door shut, as was his habit, and he found that he could not attend to the papers before him, because every time he reached for his pen, He saw instead a pair of torn hands and a grey dress, and a face that had looked at him across the shortened table the night before, with neither calculation nor fear, only a steady considering attention, as though she were reading him the way she read his ledgers, and finding him, perhaps, an addition that did not yet quite balance. He went up to the east wing that night later than usual. The boy was asleep, his small dark head turned toward the lamp, his breath coming in the shallow, careful rhythm that the doctor had taught the nurses to count. Casimir sat by the bed as he sat every night, and he took the small hand in his. And he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had brought a stranger into this house under false pretenses, and that the stranger had behaved with more honor in 3 weeks than he had shown her in return, and that something would have to be done about it, though he did not yet know what. In the morning, he sent for her. She came to his study at the appointed hour in the grey dress, because the grey dress was what she wore for serious occasions, and she stood before his desk as though standing before her father's solicitor, composed and ready to be informed of some new diminishment of her circumstances. He asked her to sit. She sat. He looked at her across the desk for what felt to her like a long time, and then he said, without preamble, that he owed her an explanation, and that he had not given her one because he had not known until recently that she was the sort of person to whom explanations were owed. She did not answer. She waited. He told her about the boy. He told her in the short, flat sentences that were the only sentences he had ever learned for speaking of difficult things, and he watched her face as he spoke, and her face did not change in the ways he had braced himself for. She did not flinch at the word curvature. She did not look away at the word lungs. She did not, when he came to the part about why he had married, offer him any of the small consoling lies that polite women offered in such moments. She listened. When he had finished, she was silent for a count of 3, and then she said, very simply, that she should like to meet the boy, if he would permit it, and that she should like to do so soon, because a child who had been kept from strangers all his life would learn fear of them faster than affection if she were not introduced before he was old enough to understand he had been hidden. Casimir stared at her. He had prepared himself for shock, for pity, for the cold, civil withdrawal of a woman who had discovered she had married a man with a damaged air. He had not prepared himself to be told, gently and at once, that he had been managing the matter badly. He said after a moment that she might meet him that afternoon. She thanked him and rose to go, and at the door she stopped and turned back and said one more thing, and the thing she said was that she was sorry he had carried it alone so long, and that he need not carry it alone any further if he did not wish to. Then she left, and Casimir sat at his desk and put his face in his hands, not because he was weeping, because he was not a man who wept, but because something had given way inside him that he had not known was holding, and he needed a moment to understand what would stand in its place. She met Soren that afternoon. The east wing was warmer than the rest of the house, because the nurses had insisted upon it, and because no one had ever refused a thing the nurses insisted upon where the boy was concerned, and the room in which he kept his days was south-facing and full of a thin winter light that fell across a small carved bed, and a chair built low for a child, and a shelf of painted wooden animals arranged in a careful procession. The boy was sitting up among his pillows when she came in, and he watched her with the grave, unblinking attention of children who have spent their lives among adults and have learned to read them quickly. He was small for 4. His shoulders were uneven beneath his nightshirt. His eyes were his father's, the grey of the loch in November, and his hair was dark and fine, and stood up at the crown where he had slept on it. Tamsin didn't bend over him in the cooing way of visitors. She drew the low chair close to the bed and sat in it so that her face was level with his. And she said, in her ordinary voice, that her name was Tamsin, and that she had come to live in the house, and that she had been told he was called Soren, and she hoped he did not mind a stranger coming to say good afternoon. The boy considered her. He said after a moment, in a voice thinner than a 4-year-old's voice ought to have been, that he did not mind. He asked if she had brought him anything. She said she had not, because she had not known yet what he liked, but that if he would tell her what he liked, she would bring something tomorrow. He thought about this with great seriousness. He said he liked the painted animals, and he liked when the nurse Annalisa sang the song about the fisherman, and he liked the snow because he could see it from the window, and he liked his father very much, but his father was often tired. Tamsin said she had noticed that his father was often tired. The boy nodded, as though glad to have this confirmed by an outside party. He asked if she would like to see the animals. She said she would. He named each one for her, the brown bear and the red fox and the small grey hare, with one ear chipped where he had dropped it once, and she listened as though she were being introduced to a household of consequence, which, she understood, she was. When she rose to go an hour later, he asked if she would come again. She said she would come tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as he wished her to. He said he would wish her to for a long time, probably. She bent and kissed the crown of his head, where the dark hair stood up, and he allowed it with the same gravity with which he had allowed everything else. And she went out into the corridor and found Casimir waiting at the far end of it, standing very still in the dim light, as though he had been standing there the whole hour. She walked toward him. She did not know what her face looked like. Whatever it looked like, he saw it, and he said, in a low voice, that he had not known how to introduce a stranger to his son, and that he was grateful she had known. She said it was not difficult, only a matter of sitting at the right height. He almost smiled. It was the almost again, the faint, near smile, and it changed his face in a way she would later think about for a long time. They walked down together toward the main staircase, and at the top of the stairs he stopped and said her name, Tamsin, for the first time since she had come to Glenmara. And she stopped too, and looked at him, and he said only that he hoped she would forgive him for the manner of their beginning, and that he intended, if she would allow it, to do better. She said that beginnings were less important than middles, and that she thought their middle might do very well. He inclined his head. They went down the stairs. That night at supper, at the table that had been shortened twice now, he poured her wine himself instead of letting the footman do it, and she noticed, and he noticed that she noticed, and neither of them spoke of it, and a small warmth settled into the room that had not been there before, and old Brigida in the kitchen, who had heard from Maren that her grace had been admitted to the east wing, sent up a dish of pears in honeyed wine that had not been made at Glenmara in 12 years, and Casimir tasted it, and looked up sharply because he remembered it, and Tamsin saw that he remembered, and she ate her pear and said nothing, because some kindnesses do best when they are not named. The winter deepened, the loch froze hard enough to walk upon, and the tenants brought their children up to the lower meadow to slide on the ice in the brief blue afternoons, and Tamsin went down with baskets of bread and small twists of sugar tied in paper, and the children, who had been told by their mothers that the new duchess was a kind one, came shyly and took what she gave them and ran back to their sliding. She went up to the east wing every day. She read to Soren from the books she had rescued from the library, the old illustrated bestiaries and the books of voyages with maps tipped in, and the boy, who had been read to mostly from improving moral tales chosen by his nurses, discovered narwhals and mountain monasteries and the city of Venice, and demanded more. She brought him a small pot of bulbs from the kitchen garden in January and set them on the window-sill where the sun could reach them, and she told him they would be yellow flowers in March, and he watched the pot every morning for the first green spear and shouted for her when it came, and she came running up the stairs with her skirts in her hands like a girl, and Casimir, passing in the corridor, heard his son shout her name with joy and stopped where he stood and put one hand flat against the wall as though he needed it to hold him up. He had begun, by then, to come to the east wing in the afternoons as well as the evenings. He found her there most days, sitting in the low chair with the boy in her lap or beside her, her head bent over a book, her voice doing the different voices for the different animals, because Soren had asked her to, and because she could not refuse him anything. Casimir would stand in the doorway and listen, and then he would come in, and Soren would hold up his arms, and Casimir would lift him with the practiced, careful gentleness of a man who had carried his son through too many bad nights, and the three of them would sit by the window and watch the snow, and no one would speak for long minutes at a time, and it would not be the silence of the great dining hall, which had been a silence of distance, but the other silence, the one that grows between people who have agreed, without saying so, that they are no longer strangers. The Edinburgh doctor came up at the end of January. He examined the boy. He spoke with Casimir in the study afterward for a long time, with the door shut, and when he came out, his face wore the same careful gravity it had always worn. But there was, Tamsin thought, a small new thing in it, something that might have been a cautious surprise. He stopped her in the hall on his way out, and said, with the formality of his profession, that the child seemed to him stronger than at his last visit, and that whatever her grace was doing she should continue to do, because there were sometimes turnings in such cases that no medicine accounted for, and a child who was happy was a child who lived longer than a child who was not. She thanked him. She did not tell Casimir what the doctor had said, because she suspected the doctor had told him already, and because the kind of hope the doctor had offered was the kind that did best when it was not handled too much. She went up to Soren instead, and read him the chapter about the elephants, and he laughed when she did the elephant's voice, and his laugh was thin still, but it was a real laugh, and she stored it in herself the way she had once stored the seeds from the kitchen garden, against a spring she was beginning, cautiously, to believe in. February brought a thaw and then a hard frost again, and with the second frost came a letter from Edinburgh on heavy cream paper, addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Strathallan jointly, inviting them to a ball at the house of the Countess of Inverleith in the first week of March. Casimir laid the letter on the breakfast table between them, and said, in the flat voice he used for things he disliked, that they need not go if she preferred not. Tamsin looked at the letter. She had never been to a ball in her life. She had grown up in a house too poor for them, and too proud to admit it. She said after a moment that she thought they should go, because she had begun to understand that a wife who was never seen was a wife who was talked about, and she would prefer to be talked about a little less. Casimir looked at her across the table with an expression she was learning to read, the one in which something he had not expected was rearranging itself behind his eyes. He said that she was probably right. He said also, after a small pause, that she would need a gown, because the grey dress, fine as it was, would not do for the Countess of Inverleith. She almost laughed. She said she had been aware of that, and she would write to a dressmaker in Inverness, and she would not, she added quietly, spend more of his money on the gown than was necessary to keep him from being embarrassed. He set down his cup. He said, in a voice she had not quite heard from him before, that she was to spend whatever was necessary to please herself, and that the question of his embarrassment didn't enter into it, because she could not embarrass him if she tried. She did not know what to say to that. She busied herself with her tea. He went out shortly afterward, and she sat alone at the table for a long time, and she discovered that her hands were trembling slightly, and she put them flat against the wood until they stopped. The gown, when it came, was the color of a winter sky just before snow, a deep, soft grey blue, and the dressmaker in Inverness, who had been given a sum that startled her and instructions from the Duke himself that startled her more, had cut it severely and beautifully, with no ornament except a fine cord of silver at the waist, and a narrow band of the same at the throat. Tamsin tried it on in her cold red bedroom 3 days before the ball, and Maren, who had grown bolder in her service since Tamsin had begun calling her by name, drew in her breath and said her grace looked like a painting. Tamsin looked at herself in the long glass and did not entirely recognize the woman she saw. The woman she saw stood straight. The woman she saw had color in her face, from the long walks down to the tenants and up from the loch. The woman she saw had eyes that had been used recently, for joy as well as for accounting. Tamsin took off the gown carefully and laid it across the bed, and she thought, with the clear honesty she brought to all her ledgers, that she was perhaps not plain after all, and that she had been told she was plain for so long by a house that had not looked at her properly, that she had simply believed it. They travelled to Edinburgh by carriage over 2 days. Casimir sat across from her, wrapped in his black coat, and he read papers for much of the first day, and looked out the window for much of the second. And twice she caught him looking at her instead, and the second time he did not look away when she met his eyes, and a small warmth climbed her throat that she had to turn her face to the window to hide. They stayed at his town house in the new town, a tall, narrow, handsome building she had not known he owned, and on the evening of the ball she came down the staircase in the winter sky gown, with her hair dressed by a maid Casimir had engaged for the occasion, plainly still, because plainness was her signature, but with a single silver pin that had been his grandmother's, sent up to her room that afternoon in a small velvet box with a card in his hand that said only, "If you will." He was waiting for her in the hall. He had put on his court dress, dark blue with silver at the cuffs, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had been a duke since he was a boy and had not always liked it. He watched her come down the stairs, and when she reached the bottom, he said, very quietly, that she was beautiful, and he said it as though the word had cost him something to find, and she answered, just as quietly, that he was kind, and they went out to the carriage together, and neither of them said anything else until they reached the Countess's door, because there was nothing else, in that moment, that needed to be said. The Countess of Inverleith's house was lit from cellar to attic. Carriages stood 3 deep in the street. They were announced at the head of the great staircase, the Duke and Duchess of Strathallan, and Tamsin felt every eye in the ballroom below turn toward them at once, and she did not flinch, because she had been practicing not flinching since she was 12. They descended. The Countess, a small, sharp woman of 70, with a face like a kind hawk, came forward to meet them, and she took Tamsin's hand in both of hers and looked at her for a long, considering moment, and then said, loudly enough for the nearest dozen people to hear, that she was delighted to meet the woman who had finally got Casimir Hargreave out of his fortress, and that she could see at a glance why he had stayed in it so long, because clearly he had been guarding a treasure. Tamsin, who had not expected to be defended before she had been attacked, did not quite know how to answer, and the Countess, who had not expected an answer, swept on to the next guests, and Casimir, beside her, said under his breath that the Countess was the only woman in Scotland of whom he was genuinely afraid, and Tamsin almost laughed, and the evening, against all her expectations, began. She was led out for the first dance by her husband, who danced, it turned out, with the same restrained competence with which he did everything else, and she discovered that her own feet remembered the steps her mother had taught her in another life, and they moved together down the long room under the chandeliers, and people watched, and she did not mind being watched, because she was being watched beside him, and that was a different thing. It was as the second set was forming that she saw the woman in red. She was standing by the great fireplace at the far end of the room, and she was the most beautiful woman Tamsin had ever seen, and she was looking at Casimir with an expression Tamsin recognized at once, because she had seen it on the faces of creditors at her father's door. The woman in red wanted something, and she believed she was owed it, and she had come to collect. Casimir, following Tamsin's glance, went very still beside her. He said, in the flat voice he used for things he disliked most, that the woman by the fireplace was Lady Florentine de Vere, and that she had been, some years ago and very briefly, an attachment of his, and that he had not known she would be present this evening, and that he was sorry. Tamsin looked at him. She said calmly that he need not be sorry for the past, only for what he did with it now. He looked at her with that rearranging expression again, and he said, very quietly, that he intended to do nothing with it at all. Then Lady Florentine de Vere began to walk toward them across the ballroom, and the second set forgot to form around them, because everyone in the room with eyes had seen what was about to happen, and no one wished to miss it. Florentine de Vere moved like a woman who had never in her life encountered a door that did not open for her. Her gown was the colour of arterial blood, and cut to the edge of what the Countess of Inverleith's drawing-room would tolerate, and at her throat she wore a single ruby the size of a thumbnail that caught the chandelier light and threw it back in small, angry flashes. She arrived before them, and she curtsied to Casimir alone, which was, Tamsin understood at once, an opening move in a game whose rules she was meant to learn quickly or be destroyed by. Florentine straightened. She said, in a voice pitched to carry just far enough, that she had heard the Duke of Strathallan had taken a wife, and she had come to congratulate him in person, because she could scarcely believe it until she saw it with her own eyes. Casimir inclined his head, perhaps a quarter of an inch. He said that Lady de Vere was kind to trouble herself, and that he should like to present his wife, the Duchess of Strathallan. He gave Tamsin's name with a small, clear emphasis on the title, and Florentine's eyes moved over Tamsin, then for the first time, slowly, from the silver pin in her hair to the hem of the winter sky gown. And the appraisal was the appraisal of a jeweller examining a stone she has already decided to declare paste. Florentine smiled. She said it was charming to meet her Grace at last, and that she had heard such interesting things about the marriage, and that she did so hope her Grace was finding the Highlands agreeable after the— She paused delicately, more modest circumstances of her upbringing. Tamsin felt the room lean in. She felt Casimir, beside her, go quite still in the particular way he went still when he was about to do something dangerous, and she put her gloved hand very lightly upon his sleeve, not gripping, only resting, and she answered Florentine herself. She said that the Highlands had been kind to her, and that she had found Glenmara more agreeable than she had dared to hope, and that she was grateful to Lady de Vere for her good wishes, which she would treasure in the spirit in which they had been offered. It was beautifully done. It conceded nothing, returned nothing, and named Florentine's malice without ever touching it. A small ripple of appreciation passed through the watching circle, the kind of ripple that travels through ballrooms when a newcomer has just proved she will not bleed easily, and Florentine, who heard it, lifted her chin and tried again. She said, with a brighter smile, that of course her Grace must visit her in town, because Edinburgh was so dull in winter, and a fresh face was always such a relief, and she did so want to know how her Grace had managed to persuade Casimir, who had been so very particular for so very long, to settle at last. Casimir spoke before Tamsin could. He said, in the flat voice that had silenced ballrooms before, that he had not been persuaded of anything, that he had recognized what was before him, and that Lady de Vere would oblige him by addressing his wife with the courtesy her rank required. The temperature of the air changed. Florentine's smile did not waver, but her eyes went hard and bright, and she curtsied again, more deeply this time, and she said she begged his Grace's pardon, and her Grace's also, and she withdrew, and the second set, released from its spell, began at last to form. Casimir turned to Tamsin. He said under his breath that she had handled it better than he had. She said that she had had more practice with creditors than he had. He looked at her a long moment, and the almost of a smile came and went, and he led her into the next dance, and for the rest of the evening they were a couple no one in the room mistook for anything less than what they were becoming. They returned to Glenmara within the week. The thaw was earnest now. The snow retreated up the mountainsides in long, ragged tongues, and the loch broke up with great, groaning cracks that could be heard from the house at night, and in the kitchen garden the first true green of the year began to show in the beds Tamsin had ordered, turned in February. Sorin had missed her. He told her so as soon as she came through the door of the east wing, with the unguarded directness of a child who had not yet learned that affection was a thing one ought to ration, and she sat on the edge of his bed in her travel dress and let him show her the new picture Annalisa had helped him paint, which was a picture of 3 figures standing together in front of a house, and the smallest figure in the middle was holding the hands of the 2 taller ones, and Tamsin understood, without being told, who the figures were meant to be. She did not weep. She had not yet spent the tears she had been keeping since she was 12. But she felt them gather, briefly, behind her eyes, and she bent and kissed the boy's hair, and told him the picture was the finest thing she had ever been given, which was true. Spring came in earnest in April. The roses in the South Walk, pruned hard in December by a woman who had not known what she was doing and had done it well anyway, threw out new red shoots along every cane, and old Ewan Calloway came up to the house one morning to tell her Grace, with the gruff astonishment of a man whose 40-year suspicions had been overturned, that there would be a flowering this June such as Glenmara had not seen since his boyhood. Tamsin thanked him. She went down that afternoon to look at the canes herself, and Casimir, who had ridden in early, found her there among the bushes, with her sleeves pushed up and a smudge of earth on her cheek, and he stood at the end of the walk and watched her for a long moment before she knew he was there. When she turned and saw him, she did not start. She only smiled, the small, private smile she had begun to keep for him alone, and he came down the walk to her, and took her earth-smudged hand in his, and lifted it, and pressed his mouth to the knuckles, briefly, and let it go. He said, in the voice he used now for the things that mattered most, that he had something to tell her, and that he had been waiting until they were home to say it. She waited. He said that he had loved her, he believed, since the afternoon she had come back from the roses with her hands bleeding, though he had not known then what to call the thing he felt, and that he had been certain of it since the evening she had walked the length of the ballroom on his arm, and refused to be diminished by a woman who had spent her life diminishing others, and that he had not said so before because he had not wished her to feel that the words were owed her, since she had been owed so much already, and given so little of it freely. He said that he was saying so now because he had come to believe she might wish to hear it, and because he could no longer bear not to have said it. Tamsin looked at him among the red new shoots of his grandmother's roses, and she said quite steadily that she had wished to hear it for some time, and that she had loved him, she believed, since the afternoon he had sent up the lambskin gloves without a note, and that she was glad they had reached the same place by different roads. He drew her to him then, carefully, the way he did everything, and he kissed her for the first time in the South Walk, under a sky the colour of the gown she had worn to Edinburgh, and the kiss was not long, and not theatrical, only certain, the way a door closes when it has finally found its frame. They walked back to the house, hand in hand, and Phineas Quayle, watching from the steward's window, allowed himself the smallest tightening of the mouth that, in a man of his discipline, passed for unrestrained joy. Letters came from Edinburgh through the spring. Florentine de Vere, it was reported by the Countess of Inverleith, in a postscript of magnificent dryness, had been busy. She had told one drawing-room that the new Duchess of Strathallan had been bought outright from a ruined drunkard for the price of his debts, which was, the Countess noted, both vulgar and substantially true, and therefore particularly hard to answer. She had told another that there was a child hidden at Glenmara, a child of doubtful parentage and worse health, kept from sight because the Duke was ashamed of him, which was, the Countess noted, vulgar and substantially false, and therefore answerable in due course. She had told a third, most recently, and most foolishly, that the Duchess had not been the Duke's first choice that season, but his third, the previous two having refused him on grounds of his temper, which was, the Countess observed, vulgar and entirely invented, and the sort of lie that gathers its own weight and eventually crushes its teller. The Countess advised patience. She advised one good public occasion, well chosen, at which the matter might be settled in the only way such matters were ever settled, which was by the truth told plainly in front of enough witnesses to carry it. She offered her own house for the purpose. She named a date in June. Casimir read the letter aloud to Tamsin in the small parlour she had opened in her first week, the one with the proper fire, and when he had finished, he laid it on the table between them, and asked her, simply, whether she wished to go. Tamsin thought about Soren, who could not yet be brought out into the world, but who would one day have to be, and who would do so more easily if the world had already been instructed in how to receive him. She thought about her father, who had died quietly in February, in his sleep, of the slow drowning he had been engaged in for years, and who had left her nothing but a letter she had not yet been able to read, and a debt-free estate she now owned outright, because Casimir had answered every claim against it in her name. She thought about Florentine de Vere, who had walked across a ballroom in red, and tried and failed to make her small. She said she wished to go. Casimir nodded once. He wrote to the Countess of Inverleith that same afternoon, and accepted, on behalf of himself and the Duchess, the invitation to the midsummer ball.